Welcome everyone to the second session of this special event that we're hosting between Cosmonaut Magazine and Marxist Unity Group. My name is Aliyah, and I'm an editor with Cosmonaut Magazine, as well as a member of Marxist Unity Group and DSA. I'm also a member of the Sioux Empire DSA chapter, or soon-to-be chapter. And today we're here to talk about democratic republicanism. Some commentators and analysts on the left and elsewhere have noted that there has been a democratic republicanism renaissance. And that begs a lot of questions. Why? How? What is that? And we have Luke Pickrell here today to kind of give an overview. Luke is a member of East Bay DSA, as well as a member of the National Political Education Committee in DSA. He is also a Marxist Unity Group member, such as myself. And he's prepared a talk for us today. And then we will host a Q&A session afterwards. So if you would like to raise your hand at the end to ask questions or type them in the chat, you'll be able to do that. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and have Luke take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Nice to see so many folks and also folks from different parts of the world. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Got a little slideshow for all of us. Awesome. So like Aliyah said, we're going to be talking about democratic republicanism today and what I call the left's rediscovery of democratic republicanism, returning to a tradition that has very strong roots in the left, but is only now being uncovered. So in 1893, Frederick Engels explained in a letter that Marx and I, for 40 years, repeated ad nauseum that for us, the democratic republic is the only political form in which the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class can first be universalized and then culminate in the decisive victory of the proletariat. So that idea of democratic republicanism, the need for a democratic republic, which was expressed right there by Engels just 2 years before he died, Marx was already dead, was actually lost soon after the Russian Revolution, but of course was lost is the key phrase in all of this, because as I'm going to argue, the left should and in some ways is returning to its democratic republican roots, and a big part of that is taking up the fight for a democratic constitution. So whenever we're talking about democracy, I think it's important to remember that the struggle for true democracy, genuine democracy, has been going on for a really long time, longer than any of us have been alive. And so as a result, this presentation is going to cover a wide swath of time. I'm going to bring in different people and different movements and try and tie them all together. So the first part of the talk is really going to center on America in the 1960s, the USA, and two movements and two people in particular: the civil rights movement, which I'm using Martin Luther King Jr. to represent, and then the New Left, which I'm using Tom Hayden and some of his companions in Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, to represent. The second part of the presentation is going to introduce folks like Hal Draper and Neil Harding, maybe better known for the writing that they did, people who really reintroduced democratic republicanism into the North American left. And part of the way they did that was by reevaluating Lenin and the history of socialist movements prior to 1917. And so I recognize that these two parts may feel a little incongruous. I don't know if they actually will. But while they talk about different places, different dates, and sometimes the language that folks are using during these two periods are different, I think we're all encountering a common language and a desire for universal and equal rights. And so everyone is, at the end of the day, talking about the same thing and fighting for the same thing, being a democratic state and self-governance. And many of them, if not all of them, also want to extend that democracy into the economy too. So I'm going to start off with MLK and the civil rights movement. As a 26-year-old minister, Martin Luther King Jr. connected what he saw as the burgeoning, what was really the burgeoning civil rights movement, to the supreme law of the land, as the Constitution was known. And he explained, we are not wrong in what we're doing, folks, that is, who are fighting for the civil rights movement. We're not wrong in what we're doing. If we're wrong, then the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we're wrong, then the Constitution of the United States is wrong. So here I think we see that Martin Luther King began his political journey, if you will, with an aspirational vision of the Constitution, basically of what the Constitution could become or could be used to do. And as I'll explain, I think that King begins to rethink what the Constitution is and what it can do. Unlike many US presidents, though, including our current one, Joe Biden, King never openly praises the Constitution as simply the Constitution. He never praised the guardrails or the checks and balances that were created by the framers. And he shared very little in common with many of the founding fathers, including James Madison, who really extolled the US's Republican form of government as a means to, and this is a quote from James Madison, to frustrate any interested and overbearing majority and to disrupt the power of the people out of doors. So put simply, there was a real distaste of democracy that the founders exhibited, and that's not found in Martin Luther King. The Constitution, we might also know, is designed to make swift and decisive action as difficult as possible. Ian last week did a really nice job of laying out the different checks and balances that pop up in our Constitution. Makes action very difficult. King, we might know, though, famously explained that wait has almost always meant never, and also that freedom and justice, of course, were his guiding lights. So he was very opposed to any system that would constrict the ability of the people to act. And he was also fond of St. Augustine's. He really liked St. Augustine, but he was fond of St. Augustine's warnings that an unjust law is no law at all, and that any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law, on the other hand, that degrades human personality is unjust. So I really think King believed that if the Constitution facilitated the pursuit of freedom and justice, it was good, and when it impeded those goals, it was not. So here we have King, a big figure in the civil rights movement. I would argue that come 1965, 1966, around the time of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, that one can say that the civil rights movement changed the US from a system of non-universal and unequal suffrage. Ian talked about the unequal suffrage in terms of the Senate, especially, in which minoritarian checks, such as the Senate, existed alongside laws explicitly barring Blacks from voting. It changed from that to one of universal suffrage. Black people are now allowed to vote, but still unequal suffrage, because, of course, the Constitution's minoritarian features are still coexisting with that expanded suffrage. So Ian talked about the Constitution's structural provisions last time. We see here that the Constitution's structural provisions, right, the presidential veto, a bicameral legislature with a particularly undemocratic Senate, a very powerful Supreme Court, all of that still remains intact. So come 1967, King, I really felt as if he'd run out of answers. Things were looking really tough. And it was in this context of what I think was really frustration and increasing despair that King, for the first time, explicitly questioned the Constitution. And he did that in what would end up being his last book, which we have here on the screen, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And in that book, he wrote that so far, we've had constitutional backing for most of our demands for change, and that constitutional backing has made our work easier since we could be sure of legal support. But now he said, we're approaching areas where the voice of the Constitution is not clear. And he says, we've left the realm of constitutional rights and we're entering the area of human rights. So I'd argue that this shows that King, literally a handful of months before he ends up dying, or ends up being killed, is questioning his ideas of the Constitution, questioning what he thought could be done within the existing political order. And I was surprised when I read this section from Where Do We Go From Here for the first time. I knew about King's gradual transition to anti-militarism and more explicitly socialist positions, but I really wasn't aware that he'd begun to question the possibility of these various international and domestic policy proposals, such as his Economic Bill of Rights, being realized through the existing Constitution, starting to question that. And I think that what King did here was that he identified the boundaries of action within the limits of the Constitution. And not only did he identify those things, but he actually said it out loud in the context of what was, of course, a mass political movement. And we'll talk about other folks during this period. King, however, is the only one to voice that uncertainty, if not growing opposition, out loud. So I'll take us now to Tom Hayden and Students for Democratic Society and some of the folks in that milieu. So Tom Hayden actually first met King in Los Angeles in 1960. He writes about it in his memoir. It was a very powerful experience for him. And 2 years later, he writes the Port Huron Statement, which is really the most influential text to come out of the New Left. And in that text, Hayden describes, and this is a quote from him, the permeating and victimizing fact of human degradation, symbolized by the Southern struggle against racial bigotry. And he also talks about the enclosing fact of the Cold War, which he says is symbolized by the presence of the bomb, the atomic bomb. America, as Hayden presents it in the Port Huron Statement, America was a country of immense affluence, but it's really riddled with racism and greed, and it's really ruled by an unaccountable elite. And SDS's original or unique idea of what they called participatory democracy really combined a critique of that incomplete democracy, as they saw it, with a call to fix the problem. They were concerned about, if you will, America's democracy problem and all the negative results that had. So in 1965, SDS organizes what was then at the time the largest protest against any war in US history. It was, of course, against the Vietnam War. And there, Paul Potter, another DSA, see, I knew I was going to mess up SDS and DSA, another SDS member, urged people to name the system that made the war possible. And of course, at another rally, Carl Oglesby, another very influential SDS member, he made a speech criticizing what he called corporate liberals, and he compared them to humanist liberals. And the corporate liberals, he said, had thrown aside folks like Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson, folks who were involved in the American Revolution, and embraced what he called the menacing coalition of military and industrial power. There was also someone else, the iconoclastic academic C. Wright Mills, who really influenced Tom Hayden and SDS's work. And in his book, The Power Elite, a pretty famous sociology text, at least in the United States, he says that, he talks about something called the domination of the military event over post-war American society. I really like this quote from him. He's talking about, in general, how people in the US understand their situation. And he says, people understand that Congress has, again, abdicated to a handful of men decisions clearly related to the issues of war and peace. They feel that they live in a time of big decisions, and they know they are in no way making any. And I see here in the quote, it goes into a little bit more detail there. They know that they were at no time consulted about the matter. So I like this quote because it's encapsulating that sense of big decisions being made in the world and the people in the United States not being consulted, not having any say over what happens. They go about living their lives. Meanwhile, a small group of people make very impactful decisions, very horrible decisions, of course, in the case of the atomic bombs being dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They feel powerless, essentially, but don't know what to do. Here's a picture of some SDS folks. I think it was taken in the early 1960s. So many people within SDS and the civil rights movement, kind of combining these two periods together now, many people in these periods understood that the US was not a democracy, is not a democracy. Tom Hayden, a very well-read person, actually knew that the US was founded as a republic, as written by the founders, and not as a democratic republic. And he actually commented very slyly, it has to be said, on the Constitution in a draft of the Port Huron Statement. However, that comment was cut. The reason being that some in SDS felt that publicly challenging the founding fathers would involve SDS, still relatively weak, in too much controversy. Other folks around Hayden felt that emphasizing the Constitution's preamble, we the people, and also the Bill of Rights, was important to do, actually needed to be held on to. And they actually saw the Constitution as something to strive towards, which I think, again, is that idea of an aspirational constitutionalism, if you will. Well, we just have yet to live up to what the Constitution can allow us to be. And there were others in SDS, many of them who called themselves socialists, who actually thought that democracy was part of the superstructure, as they would call it, and far less important than talking about relations of production, talking about the economy. So ultimately, the civil rights movement and the New Left failed to cross what I see as a conceptual Rubicon, if you will. They failed to cross that conceptual Rubicon. Both movements, civil rights movement and the New Left, they both condemned very strongly imperialism and economic inequality, and they focused on immediate struggles to advance democracy, especially when it came to the oppression of Black people in the United States. However, no one really connected those democratic values to the constitutional structure of the government. And that is to say that no one, save for King, really at the end of his life, started to question or started to ask if democracy was possible in a country with an undemocratic constitution. That was the conceptual Rubicon, I argue, that they failed to cross. And that was then a missed opportunity. I think it's not too harsh to call that a missed opportunity. But, and this will transition us into part 2 of the talk, but today's left, I argue, can and is starting to connect the dots between those democratic desires and the reality of living in a country with an undemocratic constitution. So transitioning us into part 2 of the talk, we're going to go forward a little bit in time, and then we're going to go way back in time, and then we'll come back up to the present. So, as I said, we can look back, I think, on the struggles of the 50s and the 60s, and we can recognize what we might call a constitutional blind spot. So for different reasons, these people going about the chaos of their lives, fighting these very important battles, they didn't see something that we now see, I'd argue. And that thing is that democracy can't be realized through an undemocratic political system. So here's the silver lining, if you will. If we can critique the past, we can see what didn't work or what connections weren't made in the past. It's because we now have, I think, the ideological tools needed to solve the problem. We can now see something. And I want to explain or want to explore how we can see that. We can see, if you will, the elephant in the room, as some people might refer to the Constitution, that big thing that's kind of looming. And we're now, I would say, ready and willing to face it. But the question is, as I'm going to explore, is okay, this ability to see didn't necessarily come through Martin Luther King Jr. and Tom Hayden. So how is it that democratic republicanism is making a comeback? And how are essentially people learning to see the Constitution again? So I'm going to go into a little bit about how I think that new way of seeing, that return of democratic republicanism, has emerged. Part of this is my own personal story. So I'm laying out how I came to see this. I think other people can come to see the Constitution and the need for democratic republicanism in various ways. It just so happens my way goes through Marx and Lenin. So hence why I'm bringing all of these folks in. So in the 1960s, Hal Draper wrote an article called The Myth of Lenin's Concept of the Party, in which he presented Lenin as one of history's foremost revolutionary Democrats. Hal Draper, folks might have heard of Hal Draper, he worked contemporaneously with Richard N. Hunt. Richard N. Hunt is this blue book here on my left. His book, The Political Ideas of Marx and Engels, really traced those two revolutionaries' relationship with democratic republicanism and democratic ideas. Draper and Hunt, all these folks sort of know each other. Draper and Hunt were worked contemporaneously with Neil Harding. And it was in his 1977 book, Lenin's Political Thought, here that he wrote that according to Lenin, workers didn't have to come to socialist consciousness to acquire political consciousness. And as Lenin lays out in various texts, he didn't think that someone needed to be a socialist in order to appreciate the need for democracy. In fact, I'd argue he was very critical of socialists who called themselves socialists but did not lead the charge for democracy. And then 2006, much later, Lars Lee, who had also read Draper and Harding, he publishes Lenin's Lenin Rediscovered, What's to be Done in Context. And it's here that Lee writes that the imperative necessity of political freedom is the central theme of Lenin's political agitation. And he continues on and he says, if you were willing to fight for political freedom, this is Lars T. Lee talking, you were Lenin's ally. And if you were hostile to socialism, let me back up a sec. If you were willing to fight for political freedom, you were Lenin's ally, even if you were hostile to socialism. However, if you downgraded the goal of political freedom in any way, you were Lenin's foe, even if you were a committed socialist. So I'd argue that Lenin has this belief that establishing a democratic republic to realize socialism is the paramount task of the working class movement. And that's not just Lenin, that's Lenin reproducing orthodox Marxism, as I'll get into in a sec. So from 2006, from Lars T. Lee's writing, I think we can see a growing interest in the Constitution within socialist spaces in the United States. I'm going to go into those a little bit before diving back into some of the socialist Marxist citations for a lot of this stuff. So in 2011, in Jacobin Magazine, just their second issue, the magazine is still brand new, Seth Ackerman publishes an article called Burn the Constitution. And he writes there that the Constitution makes it virtually impossible for the electorate to obtain a concerted change in national policy by a collective act of political will. The Constitution just makes it really hard to change society. In 2021, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, actually took a small step towards confronting the Constitution, a precarious step, if you will, by including the demand for a second constitutional convention and a call to abolish the Supreme Court within its new political platform. It was also very critical of the Senate and the Electoral College in that political platform. And importantly, DSA said that the nation, that is the United States, that holds itself as the world's premier democracy is not a democracy at all. And they conclude that democracy is necessary to win a socialist society. I wanted to share a few more a few more DSA things with us. So last August, YDSA, the youth branch of DSA, passed a resolution urging all DSA members in and out of elected office to take concrete action, it says on the screen here, to take concrete actions to advance the struggle for a democratic republic, such as agitating against undemocratic judicial review, fighting for proportional representation, delegitimizing the anti-democratic US Senate, and advancing the long-term demands for a new constitution. It's also important to note that Cleveland DSA and also San Diego DSA have recently passed similar resolutions. Also passed last year at DSA's convention was a resolution called Political Independence Through Defending Democracy. And that tasked DSA with creating a program to guide its work in the lead up to the presidential elections. And over many months, it really was the hard work of Marxist Unity Group NPC members who, through their hard work, won supporters and changed really the resolution's framing from saying nothing about the Constitution. And as you might have noted in the title, looking at democracy through a lens of defending an existing democracy to this. The final outcome, DSA's 2024 program, includes this bit in its preamble. It says, our ultimate goal is working class majority rule through a democratic constitution that establishes a political system with universal and equal working class voting rights, proportional representation in a single federal legislature, and ending the role of money in politics. So, I've argued that there is an interest in the Constitution within socialist circles in the United States. I've done that through presenting bits from DSA, especially, and I've also talked about how there was sort of this missed opportunity in the 50s and 60s to really develop a critique of the Constitution. So I want to go back now to where some of these ideas are actually coming from. Basically, what history is Mugg drawing from that really inspires us to inject the socialist movement with the demand for a democratic constitution? And then also, what history did Hal Draper, Neil Harding, Richard Hunt, Lars Lee, what history were they drawing from when they were attempting to really rediscover Lenin and democratic Marxism? Okay, so we're turning now to some more familiar figures. So here is a slide. This is from the movie, The Young Marx, I think. This is Marx. I don't know the actor who's portraying him. This is Engels. I also don't know the actor who's portraying him. Frederick Engels, this one, wrote The Principles of Communism in 1847 as a draft of the Communist Manifesto. And when asked about the course of the Communist Revolution, he said that above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct or the indirect dominance of the proletariat. Marx retained Engels's comments in the final draft of the Communist Manifesto. Marx wrote that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, and that the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie. Many years later, in 1891, Engels is writing to the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and he says that their new program that they've just come out with has one great fault. That's his phrase. and that great fault was its failure to demand a democratic republic. And so he writes that if one thing is certain, it's that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. And he says that this is even the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the Great French Revolution, I think here he's referring to 1793, has already shown. In Russia, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, about 20 years after that, Lenin and the Bolsheviks provided the most precise, I think, definition of democracy to come out of the socialist movement. And in their 1903 party program, the Russian Social Democratic Party writes that the sovereignty of the people, writes that we need the sovereignty of the people. And they define the sovereignty of the people as the concentration of supreme state power wholly in the hands of a legislative assembly consisting of representatives of the people and forming a single chamber. This is not Rosa Luxemburg. This is a portrayal of Rosa Luxemburg in a movie about Rosa Luxemburg. The other picture was also not Lenin. It was a portrayal of Lenin in the TV series Fall of Eagles, I think. But I liked finding pictures of folks as they've been portrayed in film. So in 1910, there was a massive demonstration for voting reform in Prussia, which was the largest state in the German Empire. And Karl Kautsky, writing at this time, got into a conflict with Rosa Luxemburg about what to do, basically. Luxemburg said that now was the perfect time for the SPD to bring back the demand for a democratic republic and expose the undemocratic nature of the Reichstag, which was the lower house of the the German political system, just as Engels had argued in 1891, which we saw just in the past. Their argument wasn't really over reforms per se, that is the argument between Luxemburg and Kautsky, because socialists are for reforms. But I think it was really over the relevance of the demand for a democratic republic. And I think Luxemburg is questioning if meaningful suffrage reforms are possible in a political system where the lower house was subordinate to the upper house and then also the Kaiser. And I really like this quote that Luxemburg has. She launches this during her polemic with Kautsky. And she writes that in Germany, the slogan of a republic is a practical war cry against militarism, navalism, colonialism, geopolitics, Junker rule, and that this slogan is only a consequence of the drastic summation of our daily battle against all individual manifestations of the reigning reaction. So I read Luxemburg as taking all these various problems in society and taking all these demands that socialists have and linking them to the importance of actually having a democratic state where the working class can express its majority interests. And then finally, the Socialist Party of America, the SPA, constantly discussed the US's political system. And this is really brought to light very clearly by Aziz Rana in his book, The Constitutional Mind. Many of the SPA's presidential platforms for over a decade advocated the abolition of the Senate and also the president's veto power. They also called for the direct election of the president and the vice president, and importantly, put forward the need for a new constitutional convention. So, taking a lot of these things together, the SPA's program, I didn't talk about Kautsky, but Kautsky also critiqued the French bourgeois republic, called it not democratic. Engels's recommendations to the SPD, as we saw. I think taking all these things together, it shows that socialists really used to put front and center the strategy of achieving a democratic republic, and that they put forward that demand that strategy in all countries that lacked a system of universal and equal suffrage, regardless of how economically advanced that country was. They put forward that demand in France, Germany, and the United States, but they also put forward that demand in Poland and in Russia. So I'll bring us to a close here, try and put all these different pieces together that I've presented us with, folks from the 1960s, folks from the 1840s and another part of the world, the DSA in 2024, so on and so forth. So I'd argue that we know the US is not a democracy, right? We went into great and very important detail about our political system, especially in Ian's presentation last week. We know the US is not a democracy. We also know that the US has its own tradition of democratic struggle, which I would say includes the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, also the New Left. There are many others. All of the history that I've presented here, and more of the history in just those events that I mentioned, really leads me to conclude that the strategy of achieving a democratic republic is still relevant because Americans want democracy and the US is not a democracy. It's almost that simple. What that means, I think, is that today, concrete political demands, Medicare for all, police reform, Green New Deal, all these big proposals that DSA puts forward, all these concrete demands should be coupled with criticism of our undemocratic political system to really explain the lack of legislative progress and the necessity of democracy. We have to be able to explain the roadblocks that exist. And I think that to do that, we should tap into this ideological center, what I'll call an ideological center of democratic republicanism. And I think that can be used to build a mass movement capable of fundamentally changing society. We have the lessons of Marxism, democratic Marxism, the civil rights movement, the New Left, all of the lessons that I've presented in this talk to draw from. And what's interesting is that they've been with us this entire time. And I think now, thankfully, folks are starting to talk about all this stuff again. So thank you very much for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Luke. That was excellent. I really, really enjoyed that. I laughed a few times with your pictures portraying our heroes from the various movies and such. It was fun, but it was really informative, and I think you did a really good job laying out a lot of the history. We are going to move into a Q&A section. All participants are, of course, welcome to participate. You can either enter your question in the chat or I think through the Q&A function, but you're also free to raise your hand if you like. And yeah. So floor is open. I guess I can start with the question is, I can't hear you. Are you muted? Okay, sounds good. I see, you know, a lot of people attribute to the rise of, you know, what people would associate with Mugg's trend of politics with the Communist Party of Great Britain as well. He didn't really touch on that a lot. So just kind of to note they're of interest as well to the audience. But you know, I wanted to ask you, just because this isn't something I actually know about you as a comrade in Mug, is I wonder, did you come into a constitutional critique and find Mug that way? Or did you come into, you know, a constitutional framework and like approach through Mug? I don't know about that, so I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think it also gets to a general question of how people develop their political perspectives, how people come to critique the Constitution, critique the thing that Ian spoke so much about last week. I personally came into MUG without any real interest or understanding of the Constitution. I think I've said to various folks, I probably never said the word democratic republic, I don't know, more than 10 times in my entire life. There was just no reason to say the word republic. I was familiar with the term democracy, and democracy was, democracy was bourgeois. Democracy was bourgeois democracy. And what existed was bourgeois democracy now, and bourgeois democracy was sort of a trick or a trap that was sort of used by the ruling class to trick the working class and so on and so forth. So I think part of this process has been a return to really trying to rescue, if you will, democratic demands. And I think that's why it really helps to draw a clear distinction between the US not being a democracy and the kind of democracy we need. But I've also talked with other folks who have come to an interest in the Constitution, and folks who are in DSA who didn't come to that route, who just saw perhaps through the Bernie Sanders campaign that something wasn't really lining up, or just paid more attention in US civics classes than I did, and noticed the description of the government that was being laid out and concluded, gosh, this doesn't sound very democratic. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you answering that. We have a question in the chat from Esther Sims, who is our comrade. Esther asks, oh, and Esther mentions missed the first 30 minutes. But is there a historical explanation why something which seemed so obvious is making a comeback now? As in, what in our current historical situation is summoning the questions which lead to democratic republicanism as an answer?
Yeah, that's a great question. It makes me think about why ideas are lost, because I agree, it does seem pretty darn obvious that the US is not a democracy, and that we would need to fight for democracy. I think there's almost a kind of internal lefty Marxist explanation for why the demand for democracy in a democratic republic dies away in general, in kind of the worldwide Marxist movement, and then also what happens in the United States and how it happens that the Constitution as it exists becomes so normal in the US. In terms of the larger leftist Marxist sphere, I locate a lot of change around the Russian Revolution and many of the years after the Russian Revolution, in which people are grappling with what are the demands that need to be realized, what are revolutions likely to look like, um, what are the importance of democratic governments, civil liberties, so on and so forth. That's a whole conversation, and I'll just say that because that period I think is so fraught with change, it's really important to look for consistencies, and consistencies in language, and consistent democratic positions. Because when you can find consistencies in how people talk about democracy or the demand for democracy, it just helps you kind of figure out what means what. And then you can also say, oh, this person who put forward this position for a very long time they changed. Why did they change? And how did that impact things, so on and so forth. In terms of why in the United States and why the SDS, why the DSA, I think there are a few reasons. One, Aziz Rana, in his book, The Constitutional Bind, does what I think hasn't really been done, save for maybe one other book, and not as clearly as he does, in tracing how the left interacts or has interacted with the Constitution. Critiques of the Constitution were relatively common leading up more or less to the Second World War. And it's then, in the context of a battle between I don't know how many world superpowers you would say, but in terms of how it's commonly presented, there's the US, there's the Soviet Union, and there are the Nazis. It's then that people in the US essentially are presented with a choice, or the narrative is framed as presenting them with a choice. American democracy, Soviet totalitarianism, whatever, Nazi fascism. And it's within that worldview that this thing called American democracy starts to look pretty good. And then the US wins. Democracy triumphs. The Constitution triumphs. And life is good for a certain section of society for a long time, always in contrast to the bad stuff out there. And increasingly, the narrative of why that's the case is because of something called US democracy. So why are things going downhill? I mean, I think one, the US in terms of a global imperial power is on shakier ground than it once was. And this is not my argument. This is actually Aziz Rana's argument. The other being that I think the left is sort of searching for what to do. We've tried various things. We've tried putting forward big legislative changes. Bernie Sanders was there. There seems to be a lack of answers in a way, and I think in that atmosphere, when things are uncertain, when things seem to be not working, that then there's an opportunity, slowly, ever so slowly, for a critique of the Constitution to come about.
Yeah, we have a few more questions and comments, so I won't take a whole lot of time. But I will say also that it is important to remember that a lot of times when things do feel kind of occulted, especially when they were once, or seemingly should be in plain sight, a lot of times that, is intentional. You have to remember that, the education that people get is usually, privately owned colleges with their own interests, stuff like that. So depending, where people are being educated, they're going to get a lot of different kinds of information. I think there's been a lot of incentive to narrativize revolutionary history in the least flattering and rational ways, especially, by bourgeois academia. It just makes sense. It's in their class interests. I think that, especially anarchistic types of rebellion are more often taught even now in media studies. You see students learning Deleuze, which, he wasn't a partyist. He wasn't a Marxist. All that to say, now we're in the internet age. So you see a lot of niche kind of strains of Marxism, different types of politics emerging. And that's natural with this surplus of information that we're suddenly faced with. And I think, a lot more people are doing their own research. They're forming reading groups. They're talking about things. We're using the internet. So there's more and more information out there. And, I think that ultimately led to kind of the initial spread and of, its kind of popularity here, if you could call it popularity. And then I'll say too, it's convenient timing, because now I think we're starting to see even more and more and more acceptance. Luke points out that this new 2024 platform or program for DSA is really explicit about the undemocratic nature of the Constitution and what have you. And I think that's because, we've always said, oh, well, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that's what protects the little bit that we have. I mean, we can't afford to risk that. That's way too scary. But I think now people are seeing, Roe v. Wade getting overturned, freedom of speech laws, that are very undemocratic, disorganizational laws, the militarization of the police, all this violence, it's scary to people. But I think, on one hand, clearly that they can see that this is corrupt. You can see it with your eyes. And, also, I think people are starting to realize the great weight of the coalition of military industrial hegemony, especially, as it exists now in this, hyper developed state. It's a scary place. So I think not because revolutionary Marxists don't believe, they believe that we can have like a cushy, cozy, fuzzy revolution where we all hold hands and sing kumbaya. That's totally not it. But I think people are realizing the danger, that, would come with like a violent conflict. And I think people are starting to think about, okay, we're told it's all been blood and gore. It's more complicated than that. Here's the situation we're in now. Like, what are our options? Like, and I think people are starting to value, partyism in a deeper way over, these kind of the formation of these little sects. And I think there's a lot of little things that are all contributing to it. But I think ultimately, it's just the expansion of class consciousness and, in the working class and in people in general, product of the conditions. All right, I went on a little longer than I meant to. We have a question here from an anonymous attendee. They ask, do you see the Democratic Republic as an end in itself? Should the need for democracy be put lower, at the same level, or higher than that of socialism? And I think one interesting thing to note about this question is that it does assume kind of a category distinction already between socialism and democracy, which is, not necessarily a contentious or unpopular opinion. Although there are a lot of people in MUG who would say that, the realization of the Democratic Republic would be socialism existing. Like we said, the Democratic Republic is the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But not every single person in MUG, I think, would say that so explicitly. I think, there's some divergence on that. But that's just a little bit of contextualization. I will let Luke answer the question now, so take it away.
Yeah, no worries. It's an interesting question. I see socialism as the full extension of democracy. So when I think about socialism, I just think about democracy extended into the most important aspects of people's lives, which of course includes how they engage in politics, but also how they engage in work and labor and social reproduction and so on and so forth. So I don't draw much of a distinction between democracy and socialism in that regard. And then I read as well. I read both the Marx and the Engels quotes, the party programs. I think the only one I mentioned, actually, I mentioned two. I mentioned the 1903 RSDLP one, the Russian one, and then didn't go into too much detail, but the Socialist Party of America's program. I read those along with now some of the statements that are coming out from the DSA as laying out a position in which the working class needs political power in order to change society, in order to continue to make inroads, I think is that phrase that I draw from Marx there in the Communist Manifesto. So I see the democratic republic as that conquest of political power. And from that position of political power, the working class would have the opportunity to actually do the things that it wants to do in society. um, and I think that there are a lot of things currently people want to do that would continue to push us farther towards what we might consider a more socialist society. And I have no doubt that desires and so on and so forth will change. But I really do see this question of the democratic republic and the democratic constitution as that question of winning political power and putting us in a position to then uh, exert what we want to do.
Yeah, and I just think as like one final little note, it's important to remember that when we talk about control, by a class, by the proletarian class, um, we're talking about the management of, you know, distribution, production, all of everything. Um, and we're also talking about ownership. So um, I think, yeah, that's one place where not everyone in Mug necessarily particularly agrees on like how exactly that's supposed to play out. Um, and I think that's okay. But I think that it's fair to say that we all, agree that socialism realized is, you know, as Marx essentially described the democratic republic, and then if you're a communist, maybe you want to go deeper than that. And I don't think that a framework like this would exclude that type of um far reaching kind of maximum idealizing. But I think it's also important to remember that um what matters is concrete demands and program. So not if we might all place democracy or socialism in a different way on this like hypothetical scale, or maybe we'd say they're one, or we'd have a different way to distinguish their fine points. But yeah, I would say that democracy very important, and it is socialism is a realization of democracy. I think that's something we all agree on. We have another question. It's from Manuel Luque. Is that right? I hope I said your name right, Manuel. Manuel asks, do you think there is an authoritarian upsurge in the United States? How does that affect the fight for political and democratic rights? That's a really, really good question. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah. I guess my first thought is how one locates authoritarianism. I mean, I think perhaps if there's a growing right wing Trump MAGA, um, something potentially worse than what we already have now, sort of movement growing, um, and how that would then relate to democracy, the Constitution, these questions, so on and so forth. Um, I hope the framework I just laid out is doing that question justice. If in fact that is the framework of the question, um, I often think about a book that two Harvard professors wrote. It came out about 2 years ago now at this point, called Tyranny of the Minority. And those folks aren't socialists. They also say at the end of the book that we need to democratize our democracy, which I think just sort of makes my head spin and raises more questions than answers. Um, but they lay out pretty clearly how I don't know if you would say progressive, maybe even slightly left of center ideas are relatively popular in US society. Or another way of saying that is that the ideas that the Democratic Party put forward are by and large not dominantly popular. Yet we have a constitutional system that has kept the Republican Party in power or given it disproportionate power for quite some time. I was even talking about the elections with someone recently, and I was thinking, gosh, that's right. Unless I'm wrong, a Republican has not won the popular vote in a presidential election in the United States, say for 2004, perhaps not in 2000, not in 2016, and so far everyone else has been Democrats. That also plays out in the Senate. In their book, they say, imagine a hypothetical 31-year-old in the U.S. This is popular, in the U.S. That abortion rights are popular, or expanded healthcare coverage is popular, or this is popular throughout their lifetime, and yet Republican administration, Republican administration, Republican administration, and then they ask how much confidence could that hypothetical person have in our political system. So all that to say, I think there is a way of, and I think it's an important point to make, to look at the political system we have, to look at the Constitution, and to note how it entrenches and amplifies particularly conservative, perhaps authoritarian political positions in the country.
Right. And could I maybe just speak to this very, very briefly? I would say, like, myself personally, like, yes, I think that the situation we're in right now does actually really track with, you know, kind of consent building and the gradual establishment of more authoritarian regimes. A lot of times in response to economic crisis, military upheaval. There's a lot of reasons for it. I think that tracks historically. None of us are psychic, but just me personally, as someone who has experienced, like, pretty close up some of the more repressive arms of the state, even in the civil local sphere. um it's scary. And I do think that that is it informs our approach. We talk about, like, the establishment of this universal people's militia, with conscription and opt-outs, and there's a reason we talk about that, and there's a reason we focus on, like, the mass mobilization of, like, a genuine mass proletarian socialist party, because I think we all realize that it's a scary situation, and I think we all realize how outnumbered we are, and how the weapons outnumber the individuals anyway, all of us. And so it's a scary place to be in historically. But if we can, like, really rally the nation around the rational realization of the total undemocracy and freedom, and the real geopolitical position that this country plays, I think that's slowly starting to happen. We all wish it was happening faster, and I think the opposition grows maybe faster than we feel like we're growing sometimes. It's really scary, but the more the merrier. Like, as far as revolution goes, numbers have always been on the side of the, you know, that's what we need to rely on. We need to rely on that kind of majority mandate. We need to rely on that buy-in, because it just repressing us needs to be a big enough problem. You know what I mean? Um, there has to be too many people with their hearts in it, because I think right now, even active counter-revolutionary measures like we saw in the Palestine encampments, on college campuses, for example. Like, I think the purchased capitalist-owned media, like, they are able to spin all these narratives, and they're really able to build consent for these preemptive counter-revolutionary measures. So I think, as much as people think maybe we're ignorant for talking about, yeah, this mass majority mandate for a constitutional convention, it's not ignorant. We're being, pragmatic and thinking about our situation and trying to be strategic, and not, kind of put people in danger, be brash. And I guess I am kind of speaking for myself here, but that to me is a really valid part of, why these politics do matter. This culture of democracy, this culture of rhetoric, you know what I mean? We need those tools because the guillotine's not going to cut it. You know what I mean? But ideas are powerful. And that's not idealist. Esther Sims. Oh wait, excuse me. First we have our comrade Amanda. I did ask her if she wanted to speak on the microphone, but she didn't respond. So I'll just I don't see anything from her, so I'll just read her question. That's okay. Our comrade Amanda says, "Hi, you talked a lot about the historical left's democratic republicanism and now its current rediscovery. But I think it would be interesting going into why it was forgotten in the in-between in the first place." Yeah, and I agree. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah. One way I think to answer that question within the left sphere, if you will, is to look at where the demand for a democratic republic usually is in party programs. Prior to 1917 or so, the Russian Revolution, I think more socialist programs basically saying how we're going to organize things, what we think we need in order to get something more, what we think we need in order to get the final stuff that we want, included these democratic Republican demands in their political section or in their minimum demand section. Demands like abolishing or limiting the power of the Supreme Court. I'll stay here within the realm of the US, directly electing the president and the vice president, getting rid of the Senate, putting more political power in a single body that's elected through universal and equal political rights. That gets lost, and I think there are a few things that come to mind. One is that the minimum section of a party's program can perhaps seem to be insignificant if the communist revolution is very close. If all of the other prerequisites, you might say, for socialism or for communism have been realized. And if it's just sort of a matter of agitating, building up union power, spreading news and information about socialism, if that's kind of all it would take in order to reach socialism. So part of the contention, or I think part of where the demand for a democratic republic falls to the wayside is around how much it's actually seen as revolutionary. Is it actually a revolutionary demand to want these things? And I think in the context of high energy revolutionary situations, it can become harder, or people can decide that those things are no longer needed, that now the maximum program, the immediate demand for communism is what's needed. The other thing I'll say is that I see a predominance of Trotskyism in the left, especially in the US left, and for various reasons. not having any necessarily a whole lot to do with Trotsky himself, though some, there is no democratic republicanism in that particular political trend. I think that, actually, in my opinion, is one of the things that most separates something like a minimum maximum program from a transitional program, is that there are no big democratic demands that would lead to the democratic republic. So I think periods of change and intense change, questions of what comes next. And then in the United States, I would just add, I think questions about what the Constitution can do, what it would mean to go against the Constitution, and perhaps, maybe as King was starting to encounter, questions about the limits of what can happen within the existing Constitution.
Right. And then just like one last thing, I guess, on Amanda's note, I think I'll maybe be slightly less polite about it than Luke was. But I'm also, here representing Cosmonaut as well as, being a MUG member. And I think that Cosmonaut does really try to occupy this discursive space where we, do have like this revolutionary loyalty to, actually existing socialist regimes, past and present. But I think we also want to, remain analytical and critical, because there is a sense that that is often lacking. A lot of times there's I don't know, for like baby lefties, there's this kind of like hyper rush to find your little niche. And I think I think this kind of party line rhetorical loyalty affects us even now in the absence of a party and a real party line. Because I think, yeah, I don't know, a lot of times people feel a lot of pressure because of the way that maybe these regimes of the past have been misportrayed and really, really villainized by the ruling class, which obviously we want to push back against those narratives. I think sometimes, maybe there's a trend to swing a little too far the other way and not be willing to, be as critical. And I think that a lot of times where there were, missteps or, even tragedies, if you look at the conditions that kind of enabled those things to happen, what you start to see, and this is, I'm kind of speaking for myself now, what you start to see is that they're already, the democratic ideals that we go back to all the way back in Marx, as he laid them out, a lot of times just are, oh, well, we got to do this, or oh, they let it slip, let it slip, let it slip. And then what happens is um when bureaucracy really cements or is able to, when there's not transparency, when there's not like clear accountability of officials, when there's classes of officials that are making a lot more than average wage workers, and resentments are forming, there's a lot of things that can lead to instability in what is already an unstable regime, because we're trying to build this brand new idea. So it's never going to be this, we don't have a perfect manual. And I guess we're maybe trying to say there is kind of a manual here in the form of the Democratic Republic, but it's still not the most secure. Yeah. But I will go to we have a lot of comments. I don't have I thought I had another question. I apologize. But I also lost my train of thought. So I will just read some of these comments because they're interesting. And then if there are any more questions, please feel free, like anything's on the table, ask whatever. We can talk about anything. And if you want to come up and, chat a little bit, just go ahead and raise your hand. But Esther was answering an earlier question. Socialism is a historically necessary qualification of democracy at the political level for revolutionaries. That is, within activist discussions, democracy brings up but naturally leaves a realm of political questions in a vague stasis that are naturally answered by the history of socialist theory and practices. But this also means that the history of democracy naturally brings up socialism with the simultaneous power to obscure it when class struggle is not engaged with. I think that's a really good and clear answer. If we don't have really firm, unwavering principles of what real uh, democratic management looks like, we find all kinds of problems. And then we have Gershom Bazerman. I hope I'm saying your name right. Um, Gershom Bazerman writes, on the anonymous question about the end in itself, the Democratic Republic as being an end in itself, I'll toss in a few cents historically. In classical social democracy, the fight for socialism was necessarily a fight for a more democratic society, and the demand for democracy was seen as a necessary component of a socialist society. That's right. But also, it was seen as a demand for conditions which allowed the working class to more openly and freely organize, and further for it to cohere as a political entity by introducing high politics, as well as economic struggles, into the purview of the class. The demand for the Democratic Republic was also a specifically revolutionary demand in Germany, in that it meant doing away with the aristocracy, etc. And likewise in Russia, it meant doing away with the Tsar. So the reformists did not want to raise this demand because it was seen as too radical. So one can see it as a popularization of the classical position on the state and the need for revolution in universal language. I agree with all of that. Luke, do you have thoughts on that? I think that's a great comment. Thank you so much for sharing, Gershom.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add in terms of what a democratic constitution would mean in the US, or even what changing the Constitution would mean in the US, I think means particular things to the United States that I don't quite have totally worked out, except to say that we've been talking about the Constitution, the US Constitution, the past 2 weeks. And people in the United States, I don't think it's wrong to say, see their Constitution differently than how most other people in other countries see their Constitution. I've been in Mexico for a little while. The Mexican Constitution changes on average once a year. The president right now wants to pass 20 constitutional reforms in 3 months. So there's just sort of a different way of talking about what the Constitution is. And because of that, I think two things. One, it makes it hard for people who want socialism and democracy in the U.S. Because you're coming up against this really powerful obstacle, and it perhaps makes things a little, I don't know if easy is the right word, but there's a sense that the U.S. Constitution is so big and also kind of so, I think, at this point, really brittle and really frozen, that to start tapping at it really starts to touch core political questions. And so, in terms of the demand for a democratic republic being a revolutionary demand, I absolutely think it is a revolutionary demand in the United States, to change the political order, and to change how decisions are made, who makes those decisions, to introduce, it would be, I would argue, for the first time, universal and equal suffrage to the United States, would immediately, and of course, in the lead up to that, would always be touching on questions of who has power, who gets to make decisions, and then how do we change things? If we want to change things, are we allowed to change them? Well, in the US, it's really hard to change these things when you want to change them. That doesn't seem fair. So I think all of these questions start tapping into really key issues.
Right. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think you kind of, I'm sure, mentioned in, the first session, in going over, all of these undemocratic provisions, what an alternative would be. We discussed in our reader, kind of, you know, uh, the conditions, that Marx lays out, especially. Um, and so, yeah, I think that would be, a really good place to start when we're talking about, term limits, election protocols. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Um, but I think that'd be a good place to start. But I guess what I wanted to also point out too is that, it's not like, me or Luke would ever think that, Mug should just like write some constitution and try to get it going. Like, I think that, it would be impossible for, one person to say this is exactly the constitution that we would need to have, because I think it would be something we would all, it would kind of struggle over together, and we can't say exactly what it might look like. Um, I don't know why I felt like that was worth mentioning. I think sometimes we're so quick to think about, like, well, in my regime, what would I have everyone do? And when we're talking about, real democracy, we also have to consider that, we're not going to be having these, well, you shouldn't be fantasizing like we're these central committee bureaucrats, making these perfect decisions, like align with our own theory, because that's not how we would want to organize our our socialist government either.
In terms
Yeah.
of, yeah, sorry, could I go off of that real quickly? In terms of decision making and having a say and creating something, it makes me think about effective ways to talk to people about this kinds of stuff. And I really like how Rashad, who's a Mug member on the MPC, talked about it in an interview I did with him about the new 2024 program. Which is to say that I think there's a lot of power in asking those questions around, do people have decisions and a say? Did you ever get a decision? Did you ever get a say in how things are currently structured? Why not? If you had the ability to say something, what would it look like? I think there's a lot of power in asking that, and of course, we can point out to people that so few people ever got an opportunity to decide the Constitution that we still live under. More than 200 and XYZ years later, there's never really been, I think, as other people have said, any kind of public referendum in any way around how politics in the United States is really shaped. And so again, that's also then why I like that quote by Wright Mills that I brought in, which is to say, I think a lot of people recognize that there are big problems in the world. They might even have an idea about how to change it, or there are big things that happen in the world. And yet the political system we have as it's structured keeps them from really having a say in that.
Yeah, that's true. And I think too, once you kind of, learn a constitutional framework, even just people kind of complaining to you can, really become a chance to ask questions that, they might not be used to talking about. And, it depends, what kind of communities you're in. But I find that, sometimes, even people's simple expressions like, oh, why didn't I get to vote for that? Or, oh, when are they going to fix this road? Like, my blew a tire. I mean, even like little things, like, you know, uh, democracy, like at the local, national level, in the workplace, like everywhere. And, just challenging people to, you can even just play little games with them. I sometimes do it, just like, oh, well, what would we do? And like, how would we argue for it? And just engage people, people in general, I think, want to be creative about a new society, because I think regardless of wherever you fall, people are, for the most part, getting more scared, more depressed, and more poor. So, you know, I think if you're willing to go out of your comfort zone and, try to meet someone where they're at, there's always a million opportunities, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why, this constitutional strategic framework is, I find, really effective, because people who may not necessarily feel super open and fuzzy talking about establishing a socialist or communist governance, are a lot of times really responsive, when you talk about these undemocratic structures and these horrific events that we see and feel powerless to stop. We're all kind of sharing in that. um and so, yeah, I don't know, I guess I'm just piggybacking kind of, how do we talk about this? And I think just being willing to sometimes just leave egg, you don't always need to sell someone on becoming cadre that day. You can just kind of get them thinking about stuff. And, because I think we are also part of a larger, like a global social trend that's happening where people are really not able to take kind of what's happening. Um, I see. Um, Gershom, I think I've said this, so no problem if not. But just if you want to chat, feel free to raise your hand and I can get you on the mic. But I can read this comment. This is interesting as well. Gershom Bazerman writes, as a point of historical pedantry, which we love here, I'd also note that in the Trotskyist tradition, there's the call for the Constituent Assembly, notably in China and Spain, and the book Socialism on Trial, which recounts the struggle for democratic rights by those Trotskyists imprisoned under the Smith Act for opposition to US involvement in World War II and their militant activities in the Teamsters. Yeah, that's really interesting context. I, I appreciate that. Thanks for bringing that up. Um, yeah, I actually, to be honest, I have not read that book. It's terrible. It's been on my list for ages, so I'll have to push it to the top. Um, we do have about a half an hour left. I feel like Luke ran a little under time, which no one can complain about. But if anyone has any other questions about anything at all, don't be shy. Um, I'll leave it open for a minute. We do have time. Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and is that okay, Luke? We have Faradun Dadras, I think. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. I I apologize. I hosted a webinar, but there we go. All right. There you go. You should be able to talk now.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, we do. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for the great talk.
Would you just maybe introduce yourself just really quickly?
Yeah,
whatever you want to say.
I'm Iranian American left, very interested in the subject. It was a very good talk. And look, I've read and listened to him a few times. I'm really interested in it. I'd like to make a small point and then ask one or two questions. In America, I definitely agree that a democratic republic is what we need, which brings socialism and democracy all together. But the point is, I've read a few other stuff from Mike McNair, CP of Great Britain, which has what Luke talked about, has some similarity to what he says, especially in his book, Strategy and Tactics. So if we need, which I do agree that we need to have a new constitution in America in order to basically move towards socialism. But don't you think that appearance of a constitution, a new and democratic constitution, would need a revolution? And the revolution, a socialist revolution, under the what I've heard is can happen in a correct way under the leadership of independent left organizations, or at least one great socialist organization, let's say DSA, hopefully by that time, is as extensive as possible. That's one. And secondly, as an Iranian interested in my own country and all that, of course, unfortunately, among many left who think traditionally, and not just in Iran, but many other areas, anytime you use the word republic, they think it's a bourgeois word and all that, which I don't think so. And I think going back to Marx and Engels and even to Lenin at certain stage, Republicanism is a form of democracy for running socialism. But the point is, in those countries, like in Iran, that we have very, very small, weak left organizations, but we still want to have freedom and democracy at minimum. Don't you think that slogans of a republic will be correct if the left organizations get into coalition with other progressive groups? Look, sort of talked about Mexico, that in Mexico, they do many reforms in the constitutions. And I heard that recently we have a left president pro-left, or sort of a progressive person in power. Don't you think moving in that direction, especially in countries in Iran and Middle East that we have repressive regimes, going in the direction of republicanism, even though it is still far from a democratic republic that socialism wants to have? Don't you think that would be a good idea? Anyway, it wasn't very related to your talk, but I really appreciate and really learned, and thank you. Bye.
Oh, no problem. I actually, if you don't mind, were you asking Luke? I can go to Luke. I just wasn't sure if it was.
Yes, I was asking Luke.
Okay, sounds good. All right, go ahead, Luke. No problem.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for your comments and your questions. I have some responses, and if other folks do too. The first thing, building a movement. How do we build a movement? I think is what people in the United States are trying to figure out. I think that's sort of what we're all trying to figure out. It could be that when a movement in the United States develops, it has those it has more explicit demands for socialism. And I think part of this process is trying to figure out what engages people, what gets people politically active, what speaks to people. And that is a question then, I think, of what you prioritize talking about. And that gets into a whole conversation, I think, around the words people use, the history people appeal to, so on and so forth. That was sort of my hope, I suppose, in the talk, in bringing up the civil rights movement, the New Left, and then just mentioning very briefly Reconstruction, the Civil War, so on and so forth, to sort of expand the scope of ideas and history that we can draw from. But all in the process of getting people politically engaged and building some kind of movement. In terms of Republican and Democratic Republic, I think that democratic demands are always important. And I think that, I'll back up a little bit. Republic, I understand Republic as more or less the ability to elect one's representatives, or in some ways, republic just being the absence of a monarch. So you can have a republic and not have a democracy. One of the things that I skipped in talking about, but I think is interesting, is what Karl Kautsky says about the French Third Republic. And he gets into a detailed critique of how their president is elected, what powers the president has, their legislature, how it's bicameral, and how the Senate is malapportioned, meaning not representative of the population in particular areas, similar to how in the US. And basically lays out, I think, one of the few Marxist definitions of really what a bourgeois republic is and how it's different from a democratic republic. And he does that in what he's critiquing, and then proposing, ends up saying, we need a republic. If we're going to talk about a republic, we need a republic like in 1793 and in 1848 and in 1871. We actually need a democratic republic. In terms of what countries should be, what people should be struggling for in other countries that have different political systems, gosh, I'm not sure, except that I agree with you that democratic political demands are very important. That those are very important. Yeah.
And I know you were asking Luke. I can say just kind of my thoughts. I guess like the first question being, as I heard it, would a constitutional convention like itself necessitate or like already be like a socialist revolution in the sense that we imagine it, the whole shebang. And I would say it depends. I think that, like, yes, for one, we see a constitutional convention for a democratic republic that, does attain to the ideal of democracy that we talk about in, its structural mechanisms. Yeah, that would be revolutionary. If the question is, in order to do that, will we have to perform revolutionary violence? I don't know. I think it's one of those things where, I'm not sitting here with, grenades in hand, really excited to go hurt people. I think that, I mean, and there's violence everywhere. We all see it. So I think that, like I've already talked about, repression is, something that's worth considering. I think any move to in any way give power to the working class, or especially, if it is, the Constitutional Convention in like the ideal sense that, we're agitating for it, like the genuine establishment of a socialist government. Yeah, I don't think that's going to go down without a fight. I think that, it would be dangerous for us to do. I'm not going to sit here and talk about violent intentions. I don't think it's a good idea, but I hope that I get my point across there. I think that we are in more danger than the ruling classes in general already. But that we are not anti-militarist, and then I guess to the second question, is it, is the Democratic Republic the slogan and, the agitational campaign and the actual aims that, you as, you didn't say a lot about your situation, but whether it's these splinter groups, small formations, I would say that, again, like Luke, I especially particularly do not like issuing armchair prescriptions. I think that what revolutionary socialists, Marxists, communists, what have you, need to look at is, for one, weighing your demands, like with the outcome, what are you trying to achieve? If you shoot for a democratic republic in this perfect ideal sense, are you not going to be able to do anything at all? Whereas if, you can organize people around the demand for, like a bourgeois republic, and you can actually make legitimate change, like, if I in a position where you're being heavily repressed by a very authoritarian government, like, yeah, I would say that's an improvement. But again, I don't want to kind of issue prescriptions about what different parties in areas with very different conditions, and that especially are a lot more repressed politically than I am, because, like, who am I to say? Do you know what I mean? I'm not in that situation, and I think that um, that's the best, judgment of the party. You have to weigh the conditions and your goals. We have a question. I'm sorry if that wasn't satisfying. Maybe that was a non-answer, but these are complex questions. I think it's really, really great. I appreciate this a lot. We have from Mason Colbert. Many reactionaries seem to be weaponizing the concept of democracy and republic to attack minorities and immigrants. How do you think we can best counter this trend among segments of the working class? That's a really, really good question. Yeah, sorry. I apologize if I wasn't able to come to a strong enough determination on that. But oh, sorry, I have to look at the question again. My apologies. Oh yeah. Well, I mean, for one, the answer that I would always like initially preface any answer with is like, there's a lot of ways. And we should like exhaust every avenue. So, be creative, use your imagination, Um, but like for me, I would think, I mean, obviously there's the need to reclaim that language for ourselves and our aims, right? Um, and me personally, my inclination would be the best way to do that is to, talk about, okay, what does a democratic republic look like? What rights do the citizens of a democratic republic retain? What, tell me about their elected officials. Tell me about the structure of their governance. Tell me about what kind of accountability they have to the populace. Tell me how involved people are in these day-to-day decisions that structure their lives. And I think you'll see, I think, through using, concrete, structures that we can talk about, comparing to what exists now is the clearest way to show, like, kind of reveal hollow rhetoric, if that makes sense. You can see, okay, they talk about democracy, but like, what does democracy really mean? What does it mean for them? What does it mean for us? And just draw our lines in the sand. That seems, to be kind of our duty at this point. I agree that there is, that language is always used by, white supremacists, reactionaries, I mean, the opposition in general, because, of our status as, the imperial hegemon. Anything patriotic can easily be just kind of like, I don't know, yeah, kind of a dog whistle. It doesn't have to necessarily mean anything. It's just signaling allegiance, with the ruling order, you know? That's the way I see it. Luke, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, similar to what you said, I think there's always a place to ask more questions and really draw out what someone means when they use a word. That's sort of a general point about, I suppose, linguistics and words, is just that words get used to mean a lot of different things. And there are assumptions that people carry about what words mean. And so because democracy is used in so many different ways, to the point in which it, for all intents and purposes, in average day discourse, doesn't even really have much of a definition. it's important, I think, to really nail down a definition. Someone was actually pointing out to me recently that if you go onto the Wikipedia page for democracy, you'd struggle to come away with any understanding of what democracy is. And it could be just a very general statement. So I think that there's a lot of utility in having a concrete definition about what democracy is, and then sticking to that definition. I think part of that process for me, once I come up with my definition of democracy, is to then be consistent in saying we don't have democracy in the United States, and to not really equivocate. Because I think when you try and say, well, there's democracy here, but not really democracy there, and there was democracy here, but now it's less, more, so on and so forth, you start getting, I think, pretty confused. You can read actually a lot of books in which very educated people say the US has never been a democracy, and then maybe the next sentence, our democracy is under threat, or we need to strengthen our democracy. There's a real poverty of strong definitions. So in terms of how I would respond to people who are, I don't know, weaponizing democracy, doing anything against people who aren't from the United States or who are coming to the United States, I think that talking about innate, meaning you have them just because you're born, universal, meaning they apply to everyone, and then equal, meaning they're equal. Innate, universal, and equal rights is a key part of democracy. And Tom Paine was someone who really put forward the idea of innate, universal, and equal rights, and he called himself famously a citizen of the world. So any talk of democracy, if it's not universal and equal, and instills those values to people, regardless of who they are, but simply because they're alive as a human, I think you have a hard time then calling that democracy.
For me, I have kind of a slightly different answer, but it's funny because the way Luke feels about this kind of makes me wonder if I, maybe should redress my understanding. But I kind of can see when we talk about democracy, we can kind of come to the same problem that we come to when we talk about communism, because on one hand, you have communism as like an ideal of like, total freedom, harmony, mutual interdependence, it's like heaven on earth, basically, like it's kind of sticky. But then also you have like communism as a state form that can mean a whole lot of different things also. But I think what you can do is you can nail down like programmatically, okay, what is the establishment of communism? I've even heard arguments that where Marx writes about the Paris Commune, the commune ideal, that he is insufficient in idealizing how free and how democratic, whatever communism can be. Okay, maybe that's true, but we can still point to these concrete elements, right, and say, are they there or are they not? And I think it's, it's the same thing with democracy, because again, like, we talk about, Marx really saw, communism, democracy, socialism as all, being mutually informative, qualitatively, and also practically. And sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. Oh my gosh. Oh, but so I think, yeah, I agree. I apologize for that. I agree with Luke though that we do need to, establish, in the sense that, maybe democracy is kind of airy. It's this idea of collective decision making that, is like, yeah, totally equal and universal. Probably even when we do nail out like a perfect program for democracy, we will find in the future that our vision for what democracy can be will expand. But I do agree that it is still important to have something real, because it isn't just an idea. It's something we can really build. It's a way that we can live our lives. But like communism, we've never had perfect universal democracy in the world. Just like we've never had communism. So whether or not you agree that there's sort of gradations to it or not, whether it's a thing or it's not there, or whether you think there can be more or less of it, I still agree that, yeah, finding concrete points to look for, determine, are they there, are they not? If they're not, this is insufficient to be labeled democracy or a democracy, is still really important. I apologize that I kind of got stalled out there for a second. We have 5 more minutes. But I don't know that we have any other questions. Oh, we do have a comment though. I think it is important to point out that for Marxism, the democratic republic is a political regime without a bureaucratic military apparatus or separation of powers. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if we even properly addressed separation of powers being so crucial here. There's so much. I really appreciate you bringing that in. A bureaucratic apparatus garnished with parliamentary forms, Marx in Critique of the Gotha Program, cannot be called a democratic republic. That's right. Thank you so much. Yeah, there has just been really great comments, really great context in the chat, awesome questions. Some pretty like big kind of open-ended questions, but I don't mind that at all. It's fun. It can be kind of challenging. Yeah, and Mason says good point, Manuel, because it was. Really appreciate that. Well, I don't know. We don't have anything else, so I don't know. Do you think we should close out?
I think we're good. Yeah, I've really enjoyed having this discussion with you all, and always expands how I think about these things.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Luke. Thanks to everyone who, showed out for this. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. We'll have to do these more often. So thank you. I'll see you guys. Read Cosmonaut and check out Marxist Unity Group in the DSA. See you guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.